Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. This video is about British misconceptions in relation to the Second World War. Now, the United Kingdom, some people are fixated with the Second World War. It was our finest hour, as Winston Churchill memorably broadcast. So there's a lot of excessive self-laudation in the United Kingdom in relation to the Second World War. Of course, the UK does deserve to pat itself on the back for this, but sometimes it's overblown. So I don't wish to be demeaning. I suppose I'm trying to offer a corrective to some distortions that have gone on. There's a lot of popular mythology in relation to the war, and of course, people generally like to look on the glorious chapters in their country's history, to overlook the more shameful ones, to exaggerate their successes, to downplay or disregard their failures, to emphasize the righteous conduct of the compatriots, to overlook or excuse or deny the unrighteous conduct of their countrymen, and so on. So there are plenty valorous deeds committed by British people at this time. But just like in every conflict, there were good and bad people on both sides. Just because someone happened to be born of a particular nationality doesn't mean that he or she was bad or indeed good, and people serve whichever cause. You think of, let's say, men who were British soldiers in that time. Had that same individual been born German, he surely would have served the other cause. There are very, very few people who actually went to fight for the other country. And that's the thing. Is it fighting for the country or the ideology or both or what? Or do we just follow the crowd? I think that's the safest thing to do. We're mostly quite sheepish. All right, so go through them in no particular order. I often hear that the United Kingdom fought for democracy. Well, of course, most people don't know much about democracy, are not politically conscious, not very clued up, scarcely politically literate. They don't really know or care about it. You see how low electoral turnout is. So I don't really think that's the case. Because, of course, some British soldiers would have been members of the British Union of Fascists, or they would have been communists or whatever. It's not as though the Third Reich had any wish to impose its political system on the United Kingdom. Now, it's quite true that the Third Reich, that's Germany, was a tyranny, and a particularly pernicious one at that time. But as Mosley said, that whatever Hitler said 1,000 times, that fascism is not a good for export. I don't know of any evidence that Berlin attempted to or wished to install a similar system in the United Kingdom. When the war broke out, they thought, well, they might have to subjugate it, but previously that was not a goal of theirs. And most Britishers knew little or nothing of Poland. As Neville Chamberlain in 1938 said of Czechoslovakia, it's a faraway country of which we know little. So many people would not have been able to find Poland on the map in 1939. Remember, it only existed as an independent country for 21 years prior to that. Of course, you go back to the 18th century, yes, it had existed for centuries, but British people were not aware of it. They knew scarcely nothing about it. They didn't know scarcely anything about it, and nor did they care over much. And we've got to remember that the British Empire was at its zenith at the time, and these countries were not run on a democratic basis. Like the Dominions, Australia and Canada and so forth, yes, they were self-governing. They had votes for all men and women, but most of the colonies not. They had some sort of legislative council in most of them, but wealthy men or literate men were permitted to vote, but they were fairly authoritarian. So the United Kingdom fought alone, and this is an example of really excessive self-praise. What about the empire? What about the dominions and the colonies? Now, we often focus on the dominions that volunteered to help, but remember in 1939, they all had their own foreign policy, the dominions, and they could have chosen not to declare war. By the dominions, I mean places like South Africa, Canada, New Zealand, and so forth. The colonies did not run independent foreign policies. And so you've got to think of these people who are often overlooked, the tremendous contribution of India, without which the Allies might not have won the war. Or even places like Nigeria, Uganda, Jamaica, where, again, they don't seem to get much credit for doing this, for volunteering. Also got to be realistic about the reasons anyone volunteers. They're actuated by a welter of motives. Sometimes they just want a job. Having 3 meals a day was something that could definitely not be taken for granted at the time in the United Kingdom or even in the colonies. And and the sense of camaraderie. They like the uniform. They think it makes them manly. All sorts of reasons. Just a career, adventure. Patriotism would be fairly low down the list, and idealism, as in they really know what the country's fighting for, in terms of political philosophy, I think that one's for the birds. Not many of these enlisted men were political philosophers. So the United Kingdom did not fight alone. It had fantastic support from the Dominions, which didn't have to do that. And in South Africa, it broke down the government. Moreover, some of these countries could have declared war and just barely lifted a finger to help, only theoretically been fighting. So the UK mustn't delude itself that it was alone. That's nonsense. All right, within Europe for a while, from 22nd of June 1940 on to, oh goodness, I'm trying to think, well, really, June 1941, there were hardly any countries on the side. Greece, briefly, they got crushed. Yugoslavia, briefly, again, they were subjugated. There's this notion that the war was popular. There was this grudging sense that the United Kingdom had to get on with it in 1939. There was significant anti-war sentiment back then. People writing to the Prime Minister and the King about that, saying, well, let's just make peace, we don't want to fight, blah, blah, blah. People did get demoralised. After all, there's this idea that there was a Dunkirk spirit and people were terribly gung-ho. And okay, some people were like that, but you read accounts of soldiers at the time and some of them really lost their heart, and you can forget about them all being valiant or tough. Some of them weren't. Now, I'm not scorning them for it. You know, I've got very little physical courage. I've never been near a battle, I'm very pleased to say. And I don't want to die for my country or any cause. I would like to stay alive. So I would have done likewise. I would have tried to avoid military service. I don't think you're a bad person for wishing to preserve your life. So people say, oh yes, but all these bombing raids, it only bolstered our will to resist. Now, there's some people who like that, but this would tend to polarize opinion. Other people would become despondent, say, let's just have peace, I don't care, what's it worth? Let's just go back to normality. Why are we suffering for Poland, or we've lost anyway? One thing about Dunkirk, remember, early June 1940, when the British and French troops were trapped on the coast of France, very northern edge of France, and the Germans could have finished them off but held back for a few days, and then many of these French and British soldiers were evacuated, something like 300,000 over several days. Why did the Wehrmacht hold back? Was Hitler being chivalrous? Well, that wouldn't be like him. The Germans had advanced too fast, overextended their supply lines, very low on fuel and ammunition, and so on. And the little ships came out. That's the Dunkirk spirit, this bulldog spirit of the people who are so plucky. Ordinary men and women sailing across in their yachts or anything to pick up soldiers. They were paid. We often overlook that they did it for filthy lucre. All right, they were still brave to do it. Perhaps some of them refused payment, but they were paid, something which is very much de-emphasised. Mainly they're taking people from the beach to the large ships, because the large ships obviously can't come too close to the coast. They'd run aground. So the idea people were undaunted. So obviously there are privations in the Second World War, and there were some shirkers as in the First World War, people who had a sardonic attitude and were delighted to avoid military service, find a cushy number, be it a reserved occupation, even like a gas fitter or an electrician, a Bevan boy down the mines. Now, I know they were doing hard work and sometimes dangerous work down the mines, but not everybody was manfully stepping forward to fill a soldier's grave. There were conscientious objectors, as in the First World War. There were clergymen preaching anti-war sermons. So there was a great deal of opportunism. People, the spivs, that means a black market trader, exploiting ration books, things like that. Or if somebody died, still using their ration book until the authorities found out. Because remember, to get food or clothes or anything, fuel, you had to pay the money, but also a ration book, a number of coupons. And actually, the poorest segment of the population ate better during the war than they had before. So these hardships were not popular. Would you like it? All the goodies in life, all the pleasures, the luxuries, having to go go without those for a few years, for the sake of a country you've never been to. Not many people are willing to put up with these hardships these days. So I know there was more of a community spirit, but obviously people are a little bit egotistical. Look at the conduct of the war. There's this notion that Germans are monsters, so that they shouldn't be depicted as villains. Now, of course, there are a few psychopaths amongst that nationality, as there are amongst any other. And people are psychologically conditioned, and so on. And people will just look the other way, persuade themselves the whole categories of humans are not humans. And that's why these sort of barbarities are committed. Sometimes we overestimate the cruelty of Germans, and obviously there were German people terribly bad. I'm not denying or trivializing the Holocaust, but not absolutely every story is true to the fullest extent. And likewise, there's this preposterous notion that no British people ever did anything wrong. Okay, I've not had anyone put it quite that boldly, but obviously they're bad people in all nationalities. That includes British people. Sometimes Luftwaffe pilots shot down over the United Kingdom were summarily lynched by the mob. Or prisoners of war, German prisoners of war were sometimes shot when they shouldn't have been, when they were not trying to escape or grab weapons. Well, there was a place in London, in Ham, I can't remember what it's called, but I could show you the building I might film there one time, where German officers were kept and some of them were tortured. There is this specious notion that the Allies never used torture, and that's not true. And I think a lot of people don't face up to just how tough and, well, occasionally brutally have to be. And that does involve sometimes mistreating prisoners and restricting freedom of expression and interning German civilians and blah, blah, blah. And civilians were killed in huge numbers. German civilians were killed, just as civilians of every other nationality were killed. So people often don't face up to the full horror of it, that there is no easy way to do this. There's no nice way to do this. And thank goodness I've not had to be involved in that. Perhaps I wouldn't have the stomach for it. And then there's this bogus notion that the United Kingdom won. All right, the United Kingdom was on the winning side and made a very important contribution to that, but it was really the Soviets did most of the fighting. About 75% of the German army was on the Eastern Front, and it was mainly Soviet blood and American metal. The United States being the arsenal of democracy. The United States had the industrial capacity to produce so many ships, planes, pieces of artillery, tanks, everything else. And that's why the Allies won. The United Kingdom suffered 400,000 military deaths, something like 60,000 civilian deaths. The Soviet Union would be easily 20 million deaths. So the United Kingdom had not even 1% of its population killed, whereas the Soviet Union had something like 15%, 15% of its population killed, might be considerably higher. So the United Kingdom would not have been willing to tolerate such high casualties. It was difficult enough to sustain what it suffered. And nobody starved to death in the United Kingdom, I don't think, not a single person, so far as I know. The Soviet Union, many civilians starved, and they were just treated with most abominable cruelty by their nemesis. So, the United Kingdom could not have won on its own, even with most of the other allies, even probably with the United States. I think it was crucial to have the Soviet Union there. And obviously they were helped, but not very much. The Soviets often felt acrimonious about this. They think they were being let down by the British and Americans and making them do most of the fighting. And the British were cowardly, just pulling the strings. And there is a certain logic to that case. So Churchill himself said, before El Alamein, never a victory. Or after El Alamein, never a defeat. And Churchill lamented, I can't get the victories. There seemed to be a lack of drive and self-sacrifice on behalf of the British Army. So there are many misconceptions about the Second World War, and many Britishers fondly delude themselves about the level of bravery and self-sacrifice of their countrymen. Of course, there were individuals who were heroic, and I don't want to take away from that. And it's true that the Allies were on the right side, but it's not absolutely clear-cut. There was obviously wrongdoing by Britishers and some of their allies. And let's not demonize Germans to say that they're all beastly. Let's be beastly to the Germans, as Noel Coward sang.